Welcome to Reform Thinking, and this is the Deep Dive. Here, we take source material, we sift through it, and really try to pull out the critical ideas, maybe some surprising facts, just to give you a clear grasp of what truly matters. Today's Deep Dive uses a really interesting collection of insights on global missions, and these are concepts that, well, they resonate pretty strongly with Reformed thought, I think.
They do.
Our aim is to cut through maybe some of the noise you hear about missions and really focus on the foundational pillars for making a lasting gospel impact in communities around the world.
That's right. We're digging into these materials, Brooks Busser's talks and writings mainly, to get a clear understanding of the Great Commission's goals and, importantly, how to actually reach them.
Okay.
So we'll be looking at principles for setting up Christian communities that last, and also that big challenge, often overlooked, language.
Right.
And this isn't just theory, it comes straight from the experience of people really living out this calling. So hopefully you'll get a sharper sense of how faithful work happens on the ground.
So the sources we have are excerpts from an address by Brooks Busser, some related articles, and also a timeline of his work. Quite detailed.
Yeah.
Our mission, then, for this deep dive, is to distill his core principles for effective missions. We want to draw specific lessons from his, well, pretty extensive experience.
Right.
We'll unpack what he sees as the ultimate goal of the Great Commission, what he argues is the central barrier to getting it done, and also the kind of pacing needed for real spiritual growth.
And what we hope to uncover for you are the essential truths that really define mission work that lasts. Hopefully letting you see beyond some common misconceptions and appreciate the careful, sacrificial labor that's involved.
Okay.
By the end, you should have a better idea why certain approaches yield lasting fruit, while others, maybe with good intentions, seem to fall short.
Okay, let's dig into that first big idea from the sources. A lot of folks, when they think missions, they think evangelism, maybe big crusades, individual decisions. But these sources argue the ultimate aim is something bigger, more substantial. What is that?
Yeah, you put your finger on it. The core idea here is that the ultimate objective, the main method, you could say, of the Great Commission isn't just getting individuals saved, it's planting churches.
Planting churches.
Right. And Boozer makes this really arresting point. Missionaries rarely achieve greater goals than what they aim for at the outset.
Huh. So if you only aim for conversions,
you probably won't get a lasting church. It sounds a bit backward maybe, but it makes practical sense if you think about long-term spiritual health and growth in a community. Aim for the church.
Where does he get the support for that idea? Is it biblical?
Oh, definitely. The strongest case comes straight from Acts, from the apostles' own work. Think about Acts 2, Pentecost. Thousands converted, yes, but what happened immediately?
They formed a community, the first church.
Right. The church in Jerusalem was established. That was the visible result.
Right.
Then you see it again in Acts 11. The church in Antioch gets started, another key hub. And look at Paul's own call in Acts 26. He's sent to the Gentiles to open their eyes, turn them from darkness to light, so they can receive forgiveness and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me.
A place among, that sounds like community. Belonging.
It points straight to the church, the gathered body, not just individual belief floating free. And then you see Paul later, Acts 15, strengthening churches in Syria and Cilicia.
So building them up, not just starting them.
Exactly. And Acts 16 says the churches were growing in number. The apostles were consistently working to establish and strengthen local churches. It wasn't mission accomplished until a local body was functioning.
And the sources define the church as more than just a meeting, right?
Oh, yeah. It's where believers find their identity. It's the place that we gather. It's the very essence of the Christian community. It's the living body of Christ, not just a building.
So gathering individuals into that lasting, structured body, that naturally makes you think about the long term. What do the sources say about how long this takes, the longevity?
That's key. Church planting is presented very clearly as a long-term endeavor. It's not a short-term project.
Okay.
Boozer's own work with the Yambi Yambi people. 13 years just to see the gospel take root and a church get established. 13 years.
Wow.
And the sources actually define short-term in this context as anything less than 5 years. They really push for what they call a long-haul approach.
And there's a warning if you don't take that approach.
A stark one. If new believers aren't gathered into a church before the missionaries leave, the work dies in one generation.
Guys, that's blunt.
It is. It means all that effort, however sincere, just evaporates. But established churches, They're described as outposts of heaven.
Outposts of heaven. I like that image.
Yeah, communities that continue by God's grace even after the missionaries move on. They ensure the gospel keeps going, keeps having an effect. It's about self-sustaining work, not something propped up from outside indefinitely. And interestingly, the material suggests the local church itself should have a say in the timing when the missionaries leave, rather than some arbitrary date set by the sending agency or the missionaries.
So the church decides when it's mature enough.
Kind of, yeah. It ensures the work is done according to the actual needs on the ground, not just ticking a box on a schedule.
Now, this long haul idea,
Yeah.
it sounds like it's not just about sticking around, but about seeing deeper change. You mentioned cultural ripples earlier.
Yes, that cultural effect seems to be a natural outcome when a church is truly planted. The sources show how the church's collective life and witness, along with the preached word, don't just renew individuals spiritually, they actually start to influence and change the surrounding culture.
Can you give an example?
The one that stands out is from the Yambi Yambi. These sources say the influence of the established church led to a real shift away from the common practice of wife beating. Yeah, the source even says quite directly, if you want to see a change in wife beating, plant a church. And the implication is, this applies to other deep-seated issues too, like abuse or maybe even certain kinds of poverty. It shows the gospel having a holistic effect.
So it changes society, not just souls.
Well, it changes souls, and those changed souls living together as the church start to change society. And ultimately, the sources point to Ephesians 3:10, saying it's through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known, even to spiritual powers. The church displays God's wisdom.
That's a high calling. And from there, it seems the idea is that this planted church doesn't just survive, it spreads, it multiplies.
Yes, exactly. The goal isn't just a static church, but what the sources call Christ-centered throbbing communities. Communities that continue to grow, continue to emulate, continue to stretch.
Throbbing with life.
Yeah, and this self-propagation means these local churches can then press out where outside missionaries will never get to. They carry the mission forward themselves.
So it becomes an indigenous movement.
Right. John G. Petton's work in Vanuatu is mentioned as an example. He didn't just evangelize individuals. He established churches that then grew and reproduced until nearly whole islands turned to Christ. His vision was for every people and language and nation to have such a Christ-centered throbbing in its midst. That's the picture. Active, local Christian communities everywhere, multiplying on their own.
So it's a vision way beyond just counting heads. It's about these communities becoming expansion agents themselves. How does this aim of church planting relate to other crucial things like, well, evangelism or making disciples? Are those less critical?
No, not less critical, but maybe framed differently. The sources are clear. Evangelism and discipling are absolutely vital. You can't have a church without them.
Okay.
But they aren't the ultimate goal in isolation. If those disciples aren't gathered into a functioning church, the work just won't last. The sources say all other things find their support in church planting and church strengthening.
So church planting is the foundation.
It's presented that way. Evangelism leads to the church, discipleship happens within the church, and the church then sends out more evangelists and disciple makers. It's a cycle.
And part of that strengthening is leadership.
Crucial. The aim includes raising up local leaders, elders, and deacons, so the church isn't left like infants tossed to and fro when the founding missionaries leave. Without local leadership, it stays dependent, and that kind of defeats the purpose of a self-sustaining community.
Okay, so the goal is the church, a self-sustaining, multiplying church. But what's the biggest obstacle to getting there, especially in places where the gospel hasn't reached? The sources point very clearly to one thing: language. Why language, above all else?
Yeah, it's presented not just as an obstacle, but as the dominant barrier. And kind of paradoxically, it's also the essential tool for communicating the gospel effectively and planting those churches.
Dominant barrier. Why?
The argument made is quite theological, actually. It goes back to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. God himself chose language as the means to separate people. So, the sources argue this act established language as the fundamental division. Geographic barriers, cultural barriers, those came later, downstream from the tongue, as they put it.
So tackling the language is tackling the root division.
That's the idea. And overcoming it takes enormous effort. It's described as the hardest task in missions, hands down. Seriously demanding. Even highly educated people find language learning incredibly tough. Like becoming a child again.
It's not just about vocabulary lists then. It's about really getting inside the language, sounding natural. not foreign.
Spot on. Full fluency is the goal. Why? Because the message, the gospel message, is too important to get wrong.
Right.
If you don't master the language, your communication will be badly communicated. You'll preach a weaker gospel, one that maybe lacks clarity or depth.
And how does that affect perception?
Well, if the missionary always sounds like a foreigner because of language struggles, then the God that you represent might also seem like a foreigner. The message might never quite feel like it belongs, never take full possession in their heart until it's heard in their own mother tongue, sounding like something an insider would say.
Like it's their truth, not just imported.
Right. It needs to resonate deeply, using their idioms, their ways of expressing complex ideas, even their humor or sarcasm, their rhythm.
And this obviously connects directly to Bible translation, which is often a huge part of this kind of work.
Oh, absolutely. Translating this really important book, the Bible, into the local language is core. And the sources argue that you can't do that well unless you are among the best speakers of the language.
Not just good, but the best.
Yeah, possessing a really deep grasp of all its nuances, the idioms, the humor we mentioned, but also discourse features, how sentences flow together to build an argument or tell a story. Without that deep feel, translations can sound wooden and foreign. They lack life.
Boozer himself was a translator, wasn't he?
Yes, primary translator for the Badul New Testament. That experience clearly informs his view on this. And he points to historical examples too, like Tyndale or Luther, whose groundbreaking translations came from their deep mastery of everyday English and German.
So language skill isn't just technical, it's cultural. It
Yeah.
seems tied to acceptance.
Completely tied. You can't really separate learning the language from learning the culture. Doing both allows missionaries to shift from being outsiders to becoming, in a sense, insiders. That builds trust, credibility.
How did that play out for the buzzers?
Well, they spent that initial 2.5 years immersing themselves in Badul language and culture, learning to hunt boar, for instance. That wasn't just about fitting in. It showed respect, willingness to learn their ways, and it gave the gospel message more weight later on because they were known and respected first.
Yeah.
And this deep cultural understanding, which comes through language, is what allows the missionary to help people displace their old worldview with a biblical one. Not just adding Jesus onto the existing system, but fundamentally reorienting their understanding of reality. That's key to avoiding syncretism.
Avoiding that dangerous mixing of beliefs.
Right. Without deep language and culture learning, you might just get a superficial blend, not a real heart change.
You mentioned it's demanding. The sources use words like pain, monotony. What makes language learning so tough in this context?
It's described as being front-loaded in pain, meaning the hardest part is right at the beginning. It requires a certain humility to go back to speaking like a child. Imagine being an articulate adult and suddenly you can barely form a sentence.
Frustrating.
Hugely. And it requires perseverance to overcome the monotony. Drilling vocabulary, practicing sounds, making the same mistakes over and over. It feels like banging your head against a wall sometimes.
The temptation is to rush past that.
Big temptation. A thirst to dive into ministry too quickly without paying the price of admission, which is language and culture learning. But skipping that leads to being bad communicators with weak translations.
The sources call that rush the pernicious weed of speed.
Yeah, a really vivid phrase. This pressure for quick results can stop missionaries from becoming a known commodity someone trusted, and it often results in explosive syncretism. The gospel gets mixed up and diluted because it wasn't communicated clearly or deeply enough.
So patience rooted in language learning is the antidote.
That's the argument. Slow, careful work counters the rush to superficiality.
And this isn't a new insight. You mentioned historical figures.
Right. People like Hudson Taylor, Adoniram Judson, Henry Martin, they all prioritized intensive language study. Judson spending 12 hours a day on Burmese. That shows the level of focus they believed was necessary. And Pentecost itself, you know, the miracle where people heard the disciples proclaiming the glory of God in their own language, that's seen as the beginning of the reversal of the Tower of Babel. God overcoming the language barrier he himself set up, showing the value he places on people hearing his truth in their heart language.
Okay, we've got the goal, church planting, and the main barrier, language. Now let's talk about the how, the pacing, the method. The sources strongly advocate for slow, patient growth. What does that actually mean in practice? Why is slow better than fast here?
Well, it's a direct counter to that pernicious weed of speed we just talked about. The core idea is that real, lasting spiritual growth, especially cross-culturally, is not a short-term endeavor.
Right. You mentioned Bozer considers anything less than 5 years short term.
He does. He argues for a long-haul perspective.
Hmm.
The process is compared to farmers planting crops. You don't just throw seed and walk away. You prepare the soil, you plant, you water, you weed, you wait.
Patience is key.
Or it's like marathon runners, not sprinters. It requires endurance. The sources state very clearly that slow, patient growth is far preferable to fast and quick methods that can lead to syncretism.
So speed itself can be dangerous.
It can be, if it sacrifices depth. The Yambi Yambi example again, 13 years to establish the church, and then another 8 years nurturing those new believers. That's over 2 decades. It shows that slow, steady work is often what's needed for deep roots.
And this obviously links back directly to language and culture, doesn't it? You can't rush that immersion process.
Absolutely. That need to learn the language, to fluency, to become an insider culturally, that takes time. Lots of time. You can't microwave that process.
No shortcuts.
No. And without taking that time, like we said, communication is weak. The gospel might seem foreign. God might seem like an outside God. Patient language and culture work allows the message to really take full possession in their heart because it's heard and understood within their own framework, even though that process is front-loaded in pain, requiring that humility and perseverance.
So it's about deeply rooting the gospel, not just scattering seeds widely. And that kind of rooting requires careful teaching, I imagine.
Yes, systematic, foundational teaching. First, you need the Bible translated well into the local language, which, again, takes time and skill. Then you teach what that book says.
Where do you start teaching?
The approach advocated is starting right at the beginning, Genesis 1.1. Lay the foundation of who God is, his character, creation. This is seen as essential to properly displace the existing worldview, not just add bits of Christianity onto it.
Contrasting God with their existing beliefs.
Right. Showing how the biblical God is different. Understanding creation, the fall in Genesis 3, spending a month and a half just on those first 3 chapters, like they did with the Yambi Yambi, that helps people grasp the seriousness of sin, the reality of death, and why they need a redeemer. Only then can the grace of God in Jesus Christ make full sense.
So you build the foundation before you get to the cross.
You build the whole story so the cross is understood in its proper context.
And this patient nurturing has to include developing local leaders, right, to ensure it lasts after the missionaries leave.
That's a critical piece of the long-term vision. After people come to faith, you gather them into a strong New Testament church, and a huge part of that strengthening is identifying and training local leaders, elders, and deacons.
Why is that so vital?
So the church isn't left vulnerable, like infants tossed to and fro, when the missionary presence eventually decreases. Local leaders ensure the church can govern itself, teach itself, sustain itself. It's essential for that self-propagation we talked about.
And again, that long-term investment, building up local leaders, nurturing the church, it seems to lead back to that idea of cultural change.
It does. A mature, locally led church living out the gospel inevitably starts to influence the culture around it. That Yambi Yambi example of wife-beating changing, that wasn't a program the missionaries ran. It was an outflow of the gospel taking root in the church community.
So the church itself becomes the agent of change.
Yes, it becomes that outpost of heaven, impacting its surroundings, demonstrating God's wisdom and values in a tangible way. Self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating.
And self-propagating means they start reaching out themselves.
Exactly. Mature churches start training others, maybe planting daughter churches, reaching areas the original missionaries couldn't. It becomes a movement spreading organically, like we see in Acts with churches sending out their own people.
Now, the sources also offered some categories, sort of strategic lanes for missions. Can you quickly outline those?
Sure. Buster lays out 4 categories to help think strategically, framed by the church on one side and language on the other.
Yep.
First is training national pastors, recognizing lots of energy in places like the Global South, but often with weak theology. So strengthening local pastors through good schools is key because the long-term work will have to be local guys.
Makes sense. Second,
English-speaking churches. Using English as a global language with tons of resources, the idea is to establish strong churches, bastions of light, in key international cities like Dubai or Jakarta. Strategic hubs.
third,
National language churches. This is for big languages like Mandarin, Hindi, Urdu, Bahasa. Churches exist, but often there's not enough. So the focus is planting more churches within these massive language groups in places like China or India or Indonesia.
And the last one,
Minority language churches, this is called the Pauline end of the spectrum.
Pauline, like the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, because Paul often went where Christ hadn't been named. This category is for those language groups maybe smaller, more remote, where no church exists at all. The sources estimate around 300 such languages left. Busser's own organization focuses heavily on this fourth category.
Reaching the unreached.
Right. But he stresses all four lanes are valid and needed. It's about clarity, not saying one is better than another. It helps strategize where resources and people might best fit.
So, looking at all this, the long haul, the patience, the focus on faithfulness, it really does suggest a different way to measure success in missions, doesn't it?
It really does. It shifts the focus away from just quick numbers or immediate visible results. Biblical growth, in this view, is measured primarily by faithfulness,
Faithfulness. How do you measure that?
by perseverance. Baser says that's how we measure progress. We measure it in faithfulness. Will you continue to slog on? It means staying put in tough places, enduring the pain of language learning, working patiently, even when you don't see results right away.
Like the farmer waiting for the harvest.
Exactly. Slow, patient growth is far preferable to fast and quick. Things of real spiritual depth, especially breaking into areas long held by darkness, just don't happen overnight. The real measure is seeing lasting, self-sustaining local churches established, believers growing to maturity, and local leaders raised up. That's the fruit of faithfulness.
So conversely, what is biblical growth not measured by? What are the false metrics we should avoid?
Well, clearly it's not measured by speed or rapid results. That pernicious weed of speed, driven by a thirst for results, is seen as a sickness that leads to shallow work, bad communicators, weaker gospel, weak translations, and ultimately explosive syncretism.
Just adding Jesus to the mix, basically.
Yeah, creating a confusing blend instead of real transformation. And it's not just measured by individual conversions alone. While vital, if those converts aren't gathered into a church, it dies in one generation. The church structure is necessary for longevity.
Okay.
Also, letting the mission board's timeline dictate things rather than the needs of the emergent church. The advice is let the church decide your time frame. And finally, being wary of completion language, like trying to finish the task based on certain interpretations of Matthew 24. The focus should be on faithful, strategic work, not trying to predict or force the timing of Christ's return.
This is all very clear conceptually, but the sources give us this incredible story, the Yambi Yambi experience, that really grounds these principles. Can you walk us through how Boser's work there illustrates all this?
Yeah, it's a powerful case study. It shows the long-term dedication, the language barrier, the patient teaching, all of it playing out.
How did it start? It wasn't straightforward, right?
No, it really highlights what Buzzer calls God's mysterious providence. He was actually a CFO in San Diego.
A finance guy.
Yeah. He and his wife felt called to the nations through reading scripture. After 2 years of training, they head to Papua New Guinea. But their planned landing strip, underwater, 6 inches of rain overnight.
Wow. So plan B.
Plan B, or maybe God's plan A all along, it diverted them to their second option, the Yambi Yambi people. Then came this intense journey, 7 hours by motor canoe, then another 7 hours paddling deeper into the jungle to reach their village. Very remote.
And what was the arrival like? The culture shock.
Pretty immediate. Their greeting involved getting mud smeared on their foreheads and flower petals whipped onto their faces, a sign of welcome, making them beautiful to enter the village, a real immersion from minute one.
So what were their goals going in?
They laid out 4 specific things. Learn the language fluently, teach literacy, developing an alphabet since it was unwritten, translate the Bible, and teach what the Bible says. And they promised the people they wouldn't leave until those 4 were done. But importantly, they also promised they would leave someday.
Setting the expectation for local leadership from the start.
Right. They were even adopted into clans, Brooks into the ostrich clan, his wife the eagle clan, based on looks. And to gain respect, Buzzer had to tackle the wild boar hunting challenge, kill one at night, alone with a spear. Otherwise, he was just an overgrown boy.
Did he do it?
He learned how, hunted with his Yambi Yambi fathers and brothers, became as much like them without sin for the sake of the gospel. All this immersion, language learning, culture learning took 2.5 years.
2.5 years before teaching.
Before formally teaching the Bible, yes. In that time, they also got 300 villagers through reading classes, and Buzzer was deep into the translation work for the Bedouin New Testament, laying all the groundwork.
Okay, so after all that prep, the teaching finally begins. How did they approach it?
very carefully, foundationally. They announced it 1 moon in advance, and the whole village showed up. And they didn't start with the Gospels or Romans.
Genesis 1.1.
Genesis 1.1, to establish who God is, contrasting him with the local beliefs, like their God who made pigs, then crocodiles, then imperfect man. They showed God's goodness, his perfect creation, using visual aids like a canoe full of food.
And the people responded.
Vocally, they'd yell, "Keep talking, this talk is good to my belly," if they liked it, or "Enough, shut your mouth, I'm about to throw this talk up," if they didn't.
Instant feedback.
No kidding. They spent a month and a half just on Genesis 1:3, really digging into the fall Genesis 3, calling it the hinge of all humanity. They even acted it out, with Buzzer as Satan. The villagers were yelling at Eve not to take the fruit. They grasped the significance. They connected the fall to the realities they knew. The gruesome speed of death in the tropics, the high maternal mortality rate. Then, for 2.5 months, teaching through the Old Testament, the people kept asking about the promised Redeemer. Is he the one? Abraham, David, Solomon. Building anticipation.
And then finally, Jesus.
After months in the Old Testament, they moved to the New, starting with John's Gospel. And when they got to John the Baptist declaring Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world,
What happened?
7 men jumped up asking, "Is he the one?" Bezer confirmed, "No, he's the one." And it apparently caused chaos because everyone just wanted to hear about Jesus then. Stop talking about John.
They were ready.
They were ready. After another month teaching specifically about Christ, on April 21st, 2008, the sources say the first 40 or 50 Badul speakers truly understood God's grace in Jesus and were saved.
An amazing moment. But crucially, they didn't pack up then.
No way. That would contradict everything we've discussed. They stayed for 8 more years.
8 years post-conversion. Wow.
To nurture those new believers, to see them gathered into a strong New Testament church, to watch them grow, which attracted others, to establish the church fully, raise up those local elders and deacons so it wouldn't be left vulnerable.
Completing the task they set out.
Exactly. And the result. 15 years later, that Yambi Yambi church wasn't just surviving, it was hosting a conference for 22 other churches from across the region, planting gardens years in advance to feed everyone, running training tracks. A mature, self-sufficient, outward-focused church. That's the fruit of the long, patient approach.
Okay, let's pull back a bit for the final section. The sources make an interesting distinction between God's overall mission in the world and the specific mission he's given the church.
Yeah.
Why is that distinction needed?
It's about clarity and focus, really. To avoid mission drift, the speaker points out that the mission of God and the mission of the church are not the same thing.
How so?
Well, God is obviously at work everywhere, sovereignly renewing things, involved in justice, restoring relationships, all of that. His mission is vast.
Right. Common grace, providence.
Exactly. But the church has a specific task within that broader work. And if we flatten the distinction, if we say the church's mission is everything God is doing, it can actually dull the evangelistic thrust of the gospel.
Yeah.
By maybe shifting focus too much onto social action as the mission, rather than seeing social change as something that flows from the gospel proclaimed and lived out. The sources say social change is downstream from the proclamation of the gospel.
So proclamation is primary for the church's mission.
That's the argument, remembering the primacy of the tongue, the spoken word in reaching a lost world, keeping the distinctiveness of the mission of the church clear. And based on that, missions gets defined quite precisely.
How is it defined?
As churches sending qualified workers to start and strengthen churches across significant barriers, geographic and cultural, but especially linguistic. See how it ties everything together? Churches sending to start and strengthen other churches across barriers, especially language.
Very focused, which leads to a pretty direct call to action, it sounds like.
It does. A clear call for churches to send qualified people out, especially to the furthest edges, to those last languages that still have no gospel witness, no church.
The unreached.
Yes. Because the gospel does not fall from the clouds like rain. It has to be carried by human hands, human voices. There's no backup option. God uses people.
And it challenges maybe how we view missions versus ministry at home.
It does. It argues that foreign missions should be pursued with equal energy and vigor as ministry nearby. It pushes back on the idea that going overseas requires some kind of super special calling, distinct from serving God anywhere. For some people, God's direction is simply much further to go. The call is the same, the geography is different. Hashtag outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, thinking about everything we've covered, church planting, language, patience, the Yambi Yambi story, What's the main thing you think someone listening should take away, especially if they're considering this kind of work or supporting it?
I think the sources consistently circle back to the need for faithfulness, perseverance through that front-loaded pain, especially the hard work of language and culture learning. The good results, the clear communication, the scriptures in their language, the mature churches, those come later, at the back end of that patient, often unseen labor. It's a long game.
It really is a picture of dedication, isn't it? And seeing God's grace work through that long obedience.
It truly is. Which brings us to maybe a final thought to chew on, something these sources spark.
Okay.
If God, in his providence, has preserved and spread the gospel through ordinary people learning difficult human languages, even after he himself confused languages at Babel for his own reasons, what does the miracle of Pentecost people hearing God's glory declared in their own languages tell us about God's ultimate desire and plan for every single tongue, tribe, and nation? And what does that mean for our participation in his unfolding plan?
That's a great question to reflect on. God's big plan working through very specific, often difficult human steps. Well, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep digging, keep discerning, and keep growing.